Welcome back. We're here with Roman Baber, who's a leadership candidate for the Conservative Party of Canada. So, as many of you know, the Pope recently had a visit in Canada in regards to the Indigenous people. And many of the Indigenous people felt that the Pope apologizing for residential schools and the cultural genocide on their peoples was much needed. But the plight of Indigenous people doesn't end there. And Roman, I know you've been advocating a lot of policies for different members of communities within Canada. Can you tell us about some of your policies that deal with this issue?
First, I want to mention that when people ask me what have I learned in my travels throughout the last couple of months, and I crisscrossed the country 3 times now effectively, I would say a lot of Canadians don't know how raw, how still sensitive and important the issue of Indigenous relations to so many Canadians. Um, I certainly believe that it's important that we learn from our history so we don't repeat it. But the type of divisive rhetoric that the Prime Minister uses is actually bad for reconciliation. The best thing we can do to improve for reconciliation is to improve the lives of Indigenous peoples. And so I propose to do that by a number of things. Number one, we finally have to get water right. We have no more excuses.
Yes, agreed.
We can deliver water anywhere in the world today. We can deliver it in a desert. We can deliver it in an Arctic. And we don't need filtration plants anymore or a lot of labor anymore. I'm going to use modern technology, condensation technology, to get water down by the end of my first term. Second, I think that if we're intent on defending Canadians, then we have to recognize the realities of life on reserve, in particular for Indigenous women. And right now, so many of these living communities simply do not have law and order. And I'm not afraid to say that we need to restore law and order on reserve. A lot of Indigenous Canadians are praying that somebody would come to their defense, and we don't need to worry about political correctness and actually do what's right by people. And maybe then generally, after follow-up, I'll suggest that maybe we need to rethink life on the reserve altogether.
Hey, what do you mean?
You know, I speak to some Indigenous leaders, and a gentleman recently brought an example for me. He said, imagine at any given community on reserve, the chief can say to you, you no longer live in your home, someone else is going to live in your home now. There are no property rights whatsoever. There are no rights that give anyone any habitation security. And I'm of the view that even though we have to respect cultural practices and hierarchy within those communities, it doesn't mean that we should not provide with Canadians with some basic safety and security, such as the ability to continue to live in their home without someone arbitrarily denying them that right. And so I think that maybe we need to look at title altogether and consider whether it will make sense to allow Indigenous peoples to actually own their own home. And home ownership makes communities better, makes communities safer. I think we should not be afraid to have all these difficult conversations. I've never been afraid to have conversations, and I think it's time. Many Canadians are counting on us.
Yeah, I can see how that circles together to your point, because at the end of the day, if there is more law and order, and people do have home ownership, which means it's of their property, which they want to protect and take care of because they can pass it down. And that could create a little bit more peace and safety, and again, more opportunity to not just get water, but clean water. I think really that's really what it boils down to. But the unfortunate part is that governments are still dealing with this issue right now about on treaty rights, and about some tribes have still never relinquished their treaty rights. And so really what it comes down to is language. I think going back to what I mentioned earlier, the Pope using the language of apologizing and calling it cultural genocide was really helpful. And I know now many in the Indigenous circle are talking about they don't want to use the term reconciliation anymore because it has a certain connotation. So we'll see what happens. But if you were Prime Minister...
I'm less concerned with language. I'm less concerned with tradition. I'm less concerned with hierarchy and institutions. I'm more concerned with Indigenous lives. We have a catastrophe of missing and
yes.
murdered and assaulted Indigenous women. And to suggest that we need to continue to play politics instead of coming to their defense, in my view, is not something that the government should be favoring. And again, the best thing we can do for Indigenous relations is to improve the lives of Indigenous peoples, and that means to give them, at the very least, basic safety and security.